Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome. Let's see if I can figure this out. All right, for just a minute.
That was I mean, I understand.
Here we go.
Space, and I'm happy to.
Hi, everybody. I'm unmuting everybody just for a minute or two so we can all say hello and good morning. I guess it's afternoon now.
Thank you.
Hi, Roy. Hi, Merle. RESA Davids. Uh-oh. Scary.
Good morning, afternoon.
Leftovers that are
Merrill, hi.
How are you?
Headaches. He is a brilliant, driven student who stops
Mary.
being
Hello.
Jill.
and has to do all the
Ivan.
in the morning. It's like a lassitude, and that lasts for a few weeks. It is so not him. Fine.
RESA, I think we're all stuck listening to Stan in the background.
I have to find something.
Say again?
I think we're listening to Stan in the background.
I'll have to go into the other room.
Yes, you will.
No, you're fine. You just tell him to keep it down.
I think he's almost done.
Would you get off the phone?
I'm not on the phone. I'm on a class with.
You can tell him
Bo.
I'm berating him. Tell him one of his dear colleagues
Bo
is
is berating you.
I should let you go.
Should I leave the room? Is there something going on?
I have been told that instead of
No, I'm just haranguing
I have
my
to
dear
read.
friend.
Stanley left.
No,
How
you
do you
can't.
like that? I sat still long enough that Stanley left.
See, it's always life is a waiting game. This is great. Everyone survived Pesach. Happy to be back to eating chametz.
Yes.
Yes. Some of you heard me talk about this on Tuesday, that my almost 4-year-old, I was very, very distressed that she couldn't have a bagel for breakfast any morning the last week. Hi, Bobby. And she was very happy this morning. She woke up. We got bagels delivered yesterday. I said, honey, you have a bagel this morning if you want. And for which her response was, Daddy, I don't want a bagel. After all that, she did have cereal. So there was plenty of comments involved. But
You can only try.
this is true. This is very true. She actually said this morning, she said, and Daddy, what about matzah? I said, no, there's no more matzah. I mean, there's like 8 boxes of matzah left, but okay. Making sure we have no one else in the waiting room. I'll take the, opportunity. So I think it was shared next to the link to join. There's a source sheet with some text that we're going to look at together today. If you didn't see that, I think, Don, can we share that in the chat? I think we're going to share the link in the chat here for all of us so that we can all be looking at, on its way. So we can all be looking at a selection of a bit of the text from this week's Torah portion and a bunch of hopefully interesting and thought-provoking and conversation-provoking commentaries to look at together and more importantly, talk about together. And this is supposed to be a lunch and learn. So if you do want to eat or drink, you're not going to like offend me. If you want to take a bite of a sandwich. The irony, of course, of it being a lunch and learn is that, full disclosure, we're going to spend a lot of time talking about Kashrut this afternoon, since that's a big piece of the Torah portion this week. So as soon as we get that link, we'll get going. Hi, Harold. Nice to see you. Sukasa, I'll say hi to you too, even though I can't see you. I'm glad to know you're here. And Rodney, and Miriam, and Martin.
Hi.
And Eileen.
The link is up. Bo.
Great. So, but it's not a hyperlink. It doesn't hyperlink, huh, Don? Okay, so I think you have to cut and paste. Takes one more degree of technological savvy, which we all seem to be mastering our technological savvy in this new world of Zoom. I joked last week that the miracle of Pesach that we celebrated at our Seder was the fact that we were able to get 4 elderly grandparents to all figure out how to use Zoom.
That's great.
and be able to join us.
I resent that, Beau, being an elderly grandparent.
So it is not a commentary on elderly or grandparent. It is simply a commentary on the 4 grandparents who exist in our immediate family, who could be in their 30s, but that would not make it any easier for them to use technology.
Technology.
I joked, it's not a joke, it's actually true, that maybe 5 or 6 years ago, my dad went from a 1999 circa flip phone to an iPhone like 5, and got a new car for the first time in 20 years the same week. And between the navigation and Bluetooth in the car and the iPhone, I literally had to drive to Santa Barbara to, solve some problems for him.
That's great.
It was quite the adventure. All right, so I think Don was able to actually just post the file directly into the chat. So if you haven't seen it yet, open the little chat window at the bottom, and I think you can click right on that, and it should download it to your desktop. So I'll give everybody a second, just because this will hopefully go a little smoother and be a little more meaningful if we're all looking at the text together. And maybe I can even impose on someone to read a little bit of it here and there, so that you don't just have to listen to me for the rest of the hour. Okay, so everybody managed to find the text?
No.
Whoops, there.
Rabbi, this is Miriam. I was looking for the text and I'm back on where it says launching and I lost your picture.
So it should be in the chat screen.
Go to chat. Go to chat.
She has to get back in the launch.
Touch it.
Okay.
I have it on another
I
device.
lose the picture. I click on my, at the bottom of my computer screen, I have a camera. And if I click on that, your picture comes back.
Okay. What do you hit on chat? Start video.
What is supposed to,
Oh, here you are. No.
what comes up when you hit on chat, Rabbi?
The link to the
Here.
text.
Link?
The document with the text in it that we're going to be
Oh,
looking
that's
at
what I
together.
can find. All right, I have a chumash though.
That's fine.
Here's the rabbi.
As long as someone, but most of us seems like have it.
Yeah.
Just because the commentaries won't be on the homepage. Okay, that's great. As long as a
I
couple
have it.
other people have it, so that, namely, we're going to read it all out loud. As long as a couple people have it, that'll be nice, because then maybe I can impose upon someone else to read a text here or there, and we can all kind of do this together. All right. So I'm going to start with a joke, because jokes are good when we're all cooped up at home. And it's an old joke, but a goodie. It goes something like this. The rabbi is on vacation in Hawaii, and has the experience that most rabbis, just truth be told, absolutely dread, particularly on vacation, which is you're off in some wonderful tropical place and you're sitting by the pool, or you walk by the pool and you turn around and you hear, "Oh my goodness, Rabbi!" So the rabbi is there. He's at the luau, and he's standing at the table, and they have just this huge pig from the luau that was roasted on the spit, laying there on the table with the apple in its mouth and the whole thing. And the rabbi's, reaching with the serving tongs for some of the pig. And lo and behold, the temple president from Chicago walks up behind him and says, "Oh my goodness, Rabbi, so funny to run into you here, but Rabbi, what are you doing?" And the rabbi looks at the pig and he looks at the temple president and he says, "Oh my God, would you look how they serve apples here?" Right? Look how they serve apples here. So I think that Kashrut is always, I think, an interesting thing to discuss and to talk about, particularly amongst, what I generally call liberal or progressive Jews, not necessarily politically, but religiously liberal or progressive Jews, or non-Orthodox, non-halachic Jews, those of us who don't choose to let Jewish law be the sole arbiter and decision maker in our lives. Because we all have different ideas about it. We all have different practices, and we all have different food practices. I think that maybe by the end of the conversation today, we might think of as some form of kashrut, even if we don't think of them that way today, or right now, I should say. And this week's Parsha Shmini, as we're continuing to go deeper into the book of Leviticus, is actually the first place in the Torah where some, not all, but some of the stipulations that create this matrix of these laws of kashrut appear for the first time. So we're on our source sheet on page 1 with just a little excerpt from Leviticus chapter 11. Miriam, if you're in your Chumash, where it's Leviticus chapter 11, we're starting at the beginning. We're just going to go through the first maybe 15, 20 verses or so. All right, so hopefully everybody's following along. I'll start out reading, so I won't single out anybody just yet, but hopefully we'll get some volunteers at some point here. So the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron, saying to them, "Speak to the Israelite people thus. These are the creatures that you may eat from among all the land animals. Any animal that has true hoofs with clefts through the hoofs and that chew the cud, so you may eat, such you may eat. The following, however, of those that either chew cud or have true hoofs, you shall not eat. The camel, although it chews the cud, it has no true hoofs. It is unclean for you. The daman, although it chews the cud, it has no true hoofs. It is unclean for you. The hare, although it chews the cud, it has no true hoofs. It is unclean for you. And the swine, although it has true hoofs, with the hoofs cleft through, it does not chew the cud. It is unclean for you, even if it does have an apple in its mouth. You shall not eat of the flesh or touch their carcasses. They are unclean for you. These you may eat of all that live in water. Anything in water, whether in the seas or in the streams, that has fins and scales, these you may eat. But anything in the seas or in the streams that has no fins and scales, among all the swarming things of the water and among all other living creatures that are in the water, they are an abomination for you. And an abomination for you they shall remain. You shall not eat of their flesh, and you shall abominate their carcass. Everything in the water that has no fins and scales shall be an abomination for you. The following you shall abominate among the birds. They shall not be eaten. They are an abomination. The eagle, the vulture, and the black vulture, the kite, falcons of every variety, all varieties of raven, the ostrich, the nighthawk, the seagull, hawks of every variety, the little owl, the cormorant, and the great owl, the white owl, the pelican, and the buzzard, the stork, herons of every variety, the hoopie, and the bat. All winged swarming things that walk on fours shall be an abomination for you. But these you may eat among all the winged swarming things that walk on fours. All that have above their feet jointed legs to leap with on the ground, of these you may eat the following: locusts of every variety, all variety of bald locust, crickets of every variety, and all varieties of grasshoppers. But all other winged swarming things that have 4 legs shall be an abomination for you. Locusts and grasshoppers and crickets sound good to everyone for lunch? Not so much? Okay. So ignoring some of the redundancy, certainly here. Ignoring some of the redundancy, right? We basically have 3 categories of animals with basically one big set of stipulations for each, right? So we have, land animals that walk on land, and for an animal that walks on land to be considered kosher, it has to have 2 things. It has to have cleft hooves and chew its cud. Both, not one or the other, right? Pigs come into this interesting category where they have one but not the other. In terms of fish have to have scales and no fins. Sorry, fins and scales. Swordfish, interestingly, are a big debated fish because when they are little, baby swordfish have scales. But as they mature and get older, they shed their scales. So there's lots of debate, even in the more traditional Jewish world, as to whether or not swordfish is kosher. And then when it comes to birds, and they include insects in this, right? Can't have four legs, right? If you think about two-legged animals such as chickens and things like that, and more importantly, which we'll get to in a few moments, it can't be a bird of prey, right? If we think about the commonality, and we'll talk more about this when we get to one of the texts, but if we talk about the commonality that eagles, falcons, ravens have, right? They're all birds of prey, which is not something that is considered kosher. So for those with our text sheet, we're going to move into some rabbinic commentary. So on page 2 of the text sheet.
Can I ask a question, Bo?
Absolutely. I neglected to say at the beginning, for those who haven't spent a lot of time studying with me, I'm a big believer in the fact that there's no such thing as a tangent and no such thing as an interruption. So please, by all means, either digitally raise your hand, raise your hand in person, and by all means, I'm happy to go down any rabbit hole. That's the fun here. So yes, Sukasa, please.
So how'd they come up with this list? And
Ooh, so that's a great question. And that's in large part, I think, some of some of the commentaries and texts that I've brought to share with us today are going to try to touch on. So I'm gonna punt your question a little bit, because there's a lot of different opinions, right? And rationales given certainly for some of these animals and how they might or might not make a list. So great question. Any other questions just on the text on the surface? Okay. Crickets. All right. So on page, I believe it's, yes, page 2. More importantly, text number 1. If you look, you'll see each of the texts. We have 7 texts and they're numbered. So we're text number 1. Text number 1 is from the Rambam, Moses Maimonides, 12th, arguably the most famous rabbinic commentator of all time, lived in the 12th century. He was a rabbi. At that time, you couldn't make a living as a rabbi. So he was also a physician, which I think in many ways informs particularly the commentary that we're about to read. But arguably, as I said, the most famous and certainly well-known and respected commentator of all time. This comes from his a work called The Guide for the Perplexed. He also famously has a work called the Mishnah Torah, sort of the mini or condensed Torah. He thought that Torah was a little unwieldy, certainly when trying to find a certain piece of information. So he redacted it, I guess is the best way to say it. So text number 1. Anybody want to read this? Can I impose upon a volunteer? RESA, thank you. I'll unmute you.
I maintain that the food which is forbidden by the law is unwholesome. There is nothing among the forbidden kinds of food whose injurious character is doubted, except pork and fat. But also, in these cases, the doubt is not justified. For pork contains more moisture than necessary for human food, and too much of superfluous matter. The principal reason why the law forbids swine's flesh is to be found in the circumstance that its habits and its food are very dirty and loathsome. It has already been pointed out how emphatically the law enjoins the removal of the sight of loathsome objects, even in the field and in the camp. How much more objectionable is such a sight in towns? But if it were allowed to eat swine's flesh, the streets and houses would be more dirty than any cesspool, as may be seen at present in the country of the Franks. A saying of our sages declares, The mouth of a swine is as dirty as dung itself.
Read the next little bit too.
The characteristics given in the law of the permitted animals, for example, chewing the cud and divided hoofs for cattle and fins and scales for fish, are in themselves neither the cause of the permission when they are present, nor of the prohibition when they are absent, but merely signs by which the recommended species of animals can be discerned from those that are forbidden.
Right. Okay. So taking the last part first, right? That there's nothing about having a cleft hoof or about chewing cud that essentially makes an animal kosher. Those are simply convenient, easy ways for us to be able to identify this animal is kosher, this animal is not kosher. The bulk of the text. So what is Maimonides saying is the rationale here as to why, in the, particularly pork here, is not kosher? Okay, Ivan, why don't you, here, I'm gonna unmute you, Ivan. Go ahead.
It says they're dirty.
Right.
And their mouth is as dirty as dung. I guess because we picture them being in mud and eating slop in the mud.
Yeah, certainly from an aesthetic standpoint, pigs do not appear to be clean animals. I'm told that's actually not the case from a, veterinary standpoint, but right. He also takes a swipe at the French, which I think is funny, right? This is, again, where I think that Maimonides' entire basis is in many cases this idea of sort of cleanliness, of health, of medical concerns, that it's harmful to our body, right? And that's where I think the idea that he's a physician, again, 12th century, influences this a bit, right? And I'm sure many of us have heard, well, the reason that, pigs, and namely, were not considered kosher were fears of trichinosis and all sorts of these sort of medical rationales as to why, health rationales as to why certain animals, are considered kosher or not, right? Anything else stick out in this?
Rabbi,
Ivan.
why does he say he particularly calls out fat in the second sentence, except pork and fat?
So there is the fat of the pork. So there is if you look at, I don't have it here. Don't have it in front of me, just a second. It's not in the text I shared earlier. There's a prohibition against, he's simply highlighting both the prohibition against pork, and there's also elsewhere, not in the text that we're looking at today, a prohibition against the consumption of the fat of the animal.
Oh.
So he's highlighting both of those. Similarly, which he doesn't here, right? There are many prohibitions specifically against the consumption of blood, which I gave a sermon once where I talked about the fact that I didn't think that God was really concerned that we'd all turn into vampires one day, because when you sort of read it, like, well, who would eat blood? What we don't think about is that much of the meat we do eat and consume, if it's not kosher meat, right, does have blood in it. And that's why, kosher meat is meticulously drained and salted as a means to extract and remove as much of the blood that's possible. So there are all sorts of, in some cases, obscure nuance and prohibitions against consumption of certain parts of animals and certain aspects of animals. And that's where the fat case comes in. Anything else stick out? Okay, we're going to move along. We're going to move along another century, almost, not quite, 75 years or so, to the second text, the Ramban, Nachmanides. Anybody else want to read this one? Thanks, Merle.
Did you? Okay.
I did.
Oh, wait a minute. I lost it. Hold on a second. I'll be there in a minute. Ramban on Leviticus. That
Yes.
the right one?
Yeah, number 2.
The reason for certain birds being forbidden as food is on account of their cruel nature. It is also possible that the reason for certain animals being forbidden is similar, since no animal that chews the cud and has a parted hoof is a beast of prey, while the rest all devour others. There has been found difference in nature between animals fit for food and those which are unfit, as the sages have mentioned, namely that all milks of animals fit for food curdle, whereas all milks of those unfit for food do not coagulate and cannot ever be made into cheese. Thus, they are physically different. It is possible to say on a basis of this difference in their natures that those animals unfit for food harm human beings who eat them.
Right.
Okay, I have to get to the next paragraph. Hold on a minute.
No, that's it.
Oh, is that it?
That's
Okay.
it. The next one's another text.
Okay.
Okay, so, right, again, I think this idea that, in keeping with the Rambam, this idea that there's something about these animals that is unhealthy, that is harmful to our bodies if we eat them. What else? What else sticks out to you? Why? What do all the non-kosher birds have in common, according to the Rambam?
Predators.
They're
Right,
cruel.
right, right. They're all predators. They're scavengers.
Yep.
Right. So that's, I think, the first introduction to this kind of whole framework of kashrut of, I would say, sort of the ethical imperative, right? Which I think plays out actually much more, and we'll talk more about in thinking about contemporary ideas of kashrut, but this idea that there's an ethical component to kashrut in terms of what we do and do not eat. Anything else? What else sticks out?
About the milk of the animals
Okay.
won't curdle. You can't make cheese out of it.
Right.
So
Right.
Interesting comment.
Which, as we were reading, I was thinking, since camel milk is now a thing now, right? Along with every other variety of bizarre milk other than, bovine milk that you can find at the grocery store, at least in normal times. I didn't realize you couldn't make cheese from camel milk.
Yeah.
Right?
Everybody knows.
Huh.
I didn't. Is that common knowledge? But if you think about it, right? Goat, sheep, cows, obviously all kosher, and the most common forms of cheese that we eat.
Can I interrupt? Is bison kosher?
Yes.
Really?
Yes. Bison's
Okay.
kosher. Boar, obviously not, but bison is most certainly kosher. So the next time you're on Catalina and there's a bison stampede, for those who may not know, right, there's a huge population of both bison and wild boar on Catalina Island. This is proof, by the way, that I like tangents. On Catalina Island, when I was, there's a sort of Marine Institute camp there that elementary school kids used to go to. I don't know if they still do. I did. And we were there. There was a stampede. We had to rush into the kind of barracks to escape the bison and the boar that were stampeding. So the reason there are these huge populations of bison and boar on Catalina Island, which obviously I think most of us would guess are not indigenous animals to the California Channel Islands in any way, shape, or form, is the result of a movie shoot. I think about, I don't know, close to 100 years ago now at this point. I don't know exactly when, but there was a movie shoot and they brought over, I think, a relatively small number of bison and boar for the movie shoot, and figured it was too much trouble to bring them back to the mainland, and they left them there. And, as animals do in the wild, they proliferated and we're left with a relatively large population of bison and boar in Catalina. And if you're ever there, back to your question, Ivan, and camping and in need of food and, hunt a bison, it is certainly kosher, as is, buffalo again. Yes, RESA.
What about the piranha? Do you know that one?
I do not know that one.
Ron was was going to the Amazon and wanted to know if he could eat, and he got a tshuva that piranha was kosher.
Interesting.
And it's a prey.
Really?
Interesting. So, what's the basis by which it's considered kosher?
I'm assuming that it has the things that it needs.
It has fins and scales.
Fins and scales. but it has teeth and it's a preying animal.
Yeah.
But he double checked it.
Very interesting. I
before
know
he
there's
went to the-
questions about,
Interesting.
like flounder, for example. Because of like sand dabs.
Yeah,
You can find
flounder is kosher,
on either side of the fence, but flounder's kosher and,
and it's along the bottom of the ocean. and
right.
It's easy to catch.
Bottom feeder, right.
Yeah, it's just interesting.
Fascinating.
For those who geek
The
out
big
on this
thing-
stuff, kashrut is a
The
rabbit
big
hole.
thing right now on a lot of restaurants is bison burgers and bison steaks. That's
Yes,
a very
absolutely.
popular thing over the last few years.
Yes, more flavor and less fat, apparently, less saturated fat. Better for you.
Oh, okay. That
That's
makes
a lot.
sense.
Bison buffalo, it's apparently much better for your heart than other kinds of red meat, I think.
Huh.
So
Okay.
okay. Moving right along. But again, right, just to put one more kind of underscore on the Ramban, right? This is again still in this kind of framework of the basis for this is that these foods are harmful to our bodies. There's still in essence a health kind of ramification to these foods. So the third text, again, moving right along in the centuries, we're going to jump over the 14th century and go to the 15th century. And another relatively well-known rabbinic commentator by the name of Abarbanel, a Spanish commentator from Spain. And this is an excerpt from a book, a wonderful translation of a lot of Abarbanel's commentaries. Someone want to read this for us? Thank you, Jill.
You're welcome. Many were the thinkers who took the Ramban's thesis to task, attacking it upon textual as well as philosophic grounds. The most outspoken of these critics was the Abarbanel, 15th century Spain, who refused to accept that the Torah was a repository of medical lore. God forbid that I should believe such a thing. If that were the case, then the Torah of the Lord wouldn't be no more than an insignificant and overly concise medical treatise. This is not the way of the Torah of the Lord or of its profound objectives. Besides, with our own eyes, we see how the nations that consume the flesh of the pig, detestable things, the mouse as well as the other impure birds, land animals and fish, are all alive and well, strong, and not at all feeble or frail. All of this is a clear indication that the divine Torah did not come to heal the body or to promote physical health, but rather to foster the health of the soul and to heal its afflictions. Therefore, the Torah forbade these foods because they have a deleterious effect on the pure and intelligent soul, breeding insensitivity in the human soul and corrupting its desires. This causes the formation of an evil nature that breeds a spirit of Tuma and banishes the spirit of Tahara and holiness, concerning which David implored, do not take your spirit of holiness from me.
Okay. Right. So here the Abarbanel comes along and says, wait. This is not about physical medical health, because for two reasons, right? One, the Torah is not a book of medical literature, and to devalue it or to simplify it as such, right, peels away all the other layers of meaning to the Torah. The Torah is not a book about our bodies. The Torah is a book about our souls and about our spirits and about our spiritual lives. And second, we know it's not true. We know it's not true that that eating pig or eating pork is going to make you sick, because look, all these people eat pork and they're not sick and they're fine. So clearly that's not the case.
But isn't it,
right? That his idea, I think, is that dietary laws are about self-discipline and dietary laws are about elevating our spiritual lives more than our physical lives. Any thoughts about that?
isn't it ironic that we're in a plague now, which may have come from people eating bats?
Yes,
Something ironic about that.
absolutely. Absolutely. Any other thoughts? When we think about this kind of move, I would say, I guess, from Kashrut being something about, the physical to being something maybe more about the spiritual. Yeah. I'll unmute you. Merle? Oh, I'll unmute you. Hang on.
Did it work? Okay. I think that the spiritual part is that you have to think about what you're eating, or what you're going to cook, or where you get your food. I think it's more about you have to think about it, which can be a spiritual concept.
Absolutely.
That's the only thing I can think of when I look at this.
Absolutely. And that makes me think you've read ahead 2 texts. But thank you for teeing that up perfectly for me. I'm going to move on to, I just in the interest of time, I'm going to move on to the 4th text, which is my favorite in many ways, for 2 reasons. Because I think it's the most radical text on here. And the irony of that is that it's also the oldest text on here. This is from the 3rd century. Rava, who was a sage, 3rd century sage. So again, we are 1800 years ago. He says, the mitzvot were only given so that human beings, I'll say, might be refined by them. Do you really think that the Holy One of Blessing cares if an animal is slaughtered by the front or back of its neck? No. I'm going to insert there. Therefore, mitzvot were only given to make humans better. Right? Here you have the leading rabbinic sage in the 3rd century saying all of the mitzvot, in essence, right, are not for God. All the commandments are not for God. They're for us. God doesn't need them. God doesn't care if the animal is slaughtered this way or that way, or if we eat this or we eat that. It's for us, which in some Jewish circles, I think actually today you might think might still be considered radical, but in the 3rd century, I guarantee you it was radical to say such a thing, right? And that, I think, really sort of, in many ways, sets the stage for what I would call a plethora of contemporary musings and interpretations on what Kashrut can be about, and what Kashrut can look like. Again, as being something that is for us, something that is about the spiritual, not necessarily about the physical or medical. And then, sort of to Merle's point of putting thought into it and mindfulness into it. So I'm going to read this next text. So the last 3 here are all sort of contemporary musings on Kashrut, all from, again, I said this at the beginning, the non-Orthodox world, what I would call, to get overly technical about it, non-halachic Judaism, Jews who do not see their lives as being bound solely by Jewish law. Yes, RESA.
Do we get before Leviticus the change from vegetarian lifestyle to eating meat at all? Where does that happen?
Yes. Yeah, I believe that comes, I believe, in Bereshit.
Right away in Bereshit, we changed to become meat eaters.
Pretty soon, yeah.
Without any restrictions.
Well, without any restrictions, because they're not Jews yet.
Okay.
It's Adam, right? Adam and Eve begin as vegetarians and then are given permission to eat animals.
Ah, okay.
Yeah, that sounds right to me.
I think so.
I mean, I'm going to double check that as soon as we're done here.
I'll trust you
Put in a
even if you
caveat
don't trust you.
in the video record. And
Okay.
someday someone was going to say, "Oh, look, the rabbi thought this," and he wasn't even close to right. But
I'm just curious.
But I'm reasonably confident that that's the case.
Okay.
But yes, without stipulation, right? Because all of these, commandments, particularly those in Leviticus, that come about as a part of the holiness code, right? We didn't read it in the excerpt today from this parsha, right? But the rationale for all of this is, right, because I am your, right, you are holy because I am your God.
I am your God.
I am your God and I am holy, right? So text number 5, again, a contemporary rabbi, Richard Israel. This is from his book called The Condition of Jewish Belief. And he says, I find that whether I like it or not, Kashrut brings me into contact with a series of rather important questions. What is my responsibility to the calf that I eat, or to the potato? Is the earth and the fullness thereof mine to do with as I will? What does it mean that a table should be an altar? Is eating indeed a devotional act? Does God really care whether I wait 2 or 6 hours before drinking milk after a meat meal? If Kashrut makes me ask enough questions, often enough, I discover that its very provocative quality is one of its chief virtues for my religious life. Right? To Merle's point, right, that if it forces what today I think the hot word is mindfulness, right? If it forces us to be mindful about our food choices and to think about what we eat, then that has a tremendous value for us. A quick explanation. He refers to this idea. What does it mean that a table should be an altar, right? There's this beautiful teaching that when the temple is destroyed in Jerusalem for the second time in the year 70, that the home replaces that as a temple, a sanctuary in miniature, right? A mikdash me'at, sanctuary in miniature, and that the altar is replaced by the dining table in our home. And that as a result, some would say, that we ought to put thought into what we put on that table to feed the people we love and care about. Again, in the sense of mindfulness, right? That eating a meal should not be the same thing as pulling your car up, to the gas station to fill it with gas. It can be, right? We need food to live. It is absolutely sustenance. But the act of eating can also be a holy and extraordinary act, right? We'll get to a little bit more on that in another text, right? But this whole idea of mindfulness and thought and asking these questions about what we eat, really, I think, leads to a very contemporary notion of what some call eco-kashrut, right? Which is thinking about the other environmental concerns of food beyond simply, is it this or that, right? But, and also beyond how it's slaughtered, right? Because the idea behind eco-kashrut, as many would say, or ethical kashrut, some would call it, is that, look, you can have a piece of meat, a piece of beef, a piece of bison, we were saying earlier, a piece of chicken, that based on Jewish law is kosher. It was slaughtered in a certain way. The animal, itself meets all these requirements. It's kosher. It was slaughtered in a certain way. It has a hechsher. Boom, it's kosher. However, if some of the rationale behind kashrut, particularly the slaughter, is that the animal ought not suffer needlessly, then 30 chickens in a pen that's 2 feet, square, that seems like suffering to me, right? We only care about the suffering in terms of how the animal dies. We don't care about the suffering in terms of how the animal lives, right? So based on that rationale, many argue today, well, shouldn't kashrut also be about free range? Shouldn't it also be about organic? Shouldn't it also be about grass-fed? Shouldn't it also be about pasture raised, right? Shouldn't it, all these other monikers that you can go to Erewhon during normal times or Whole Foods or any other, fancy grocery store, right? And you can buy a $25 chicken breast that, you know, has a laundry list of, you know, the chicken got a massage every other hour, you know, and should those, that aspect of suffering also be considered? And then some would say in our world today, well, what about the workers? What about the people that work at the slaughterhouse? Do they have medical insurance? Are they paid a fair wage? Do they work overtime and get paid for it? How are they treated? Right? If Kashrut is really an expression of our values, and we care about the animal suffering, then maybe there are other things to think about. Right? There was this expose maybe 7 years ago. I don't know. It was in that midst when PETA was like sneaking people into slaughterhouses all over the place and posting these just atrocious videos of, you know, what actually happens. But one of them was a kosher slaughterhouse, and they demonstrated, you know, that some of the meat that likely ends up, you know, being sold as kosher meat is not, right? There was a big scandal right this time of year, days before Pesach, like 4 years ago, what used to be called Doheny Meats on Pico, right? The guy was literally in the back with an inkjet printer printing labels and sticking them on, you know, meat he got from Ralph's or whatever and selling it as kosher. You know, so we can argue the merits, you know, is it small k kosher? And then also, you know, my one of my teachers, Rabbi Richard Levy of blessed memory, used to teach frequently that, you know, if kashrut is about animal suffering and animal cruelty, then by no means should veal be kosher, but it is. And maybe in the 20th and 21st, it was 20th when he said it, now 21st century, you know, we ought to say, well, maybe it is technically kosher or can be, but it's not, based on, you know, the totality of Jewish values that kind of are the underpinnings of kashrut, right? And the last thing I'll say, the conservative movement has actually, so there are two kind of more recent steps in this vein. You can now, which you couldn't maybe even 5 years ago, but you can now certainly buy organic kosher chicken, at least, probably beef too. There's two poultry companies, Empire, which is the largest largest kosher poultry producer in the country, buy at Trader Joe's, buy at Ralph's, has an organic line. There's another, which I like the pun, I think it's mainly at Whole Foods, called Wise Farms, W-I-S-E, right? Which is also, I believe it's all pasture raised and organic poultry. But the last interesting thing, the conservative movement a couple years ago came up with something called Magen Tzedek. And it is in essence, a second hechsher, a second stamp that goes on meat that is already deemed to be kosher from a religious standpoint, that also says it was ethically raised, the people and the workers were treated well. So it's not instead of the religious laws that govern, you know, kashrut, including that which is from the Torah portion this week, but saying in addition to that, we're also going to certify that in all these other ways, this is a product that that is in keeping with our values as Jews, which I think is interesting. Since all these texts are related, I think we're going to move through these and then we'll kind of unpack it all together, maybe all these sort of contemporary questions. I'll read this one too, because another favorite of mine by one of my favorite writers, Harold Kushner, Rabbi Harold Kushner, who I frequently read and think to myself, I can't say it any better than that. So I just figured I'd give you what he said. And this is an excerpt from his book, To Life. Let's go back to my hypothetical lunch with a friend. Watching me scan the menu, he may suspect me thinking, oh, would I love to order the ham, but then mean old God won't let me. But in fact, what is probably going through my mind at the moment is, isn't it incredible? Nearly 5 billion people on the planet, you can tell how old the book is, and God cares what I have for lunch? And God cares how I earn and spend my money, and whom I sleep with, and what sort of language I use. These are not descriptions of God's emotional state about which we can have no information, but a way of conveying the critical ethical significance of the choices I make. What better way is there to invest every one of my daily choices with divine significance, right? Quick insertion, right? He's saying what we do, how we behave, matters, has significance beyond ourselves. The choices we make, even the most mundane choices, what to eat for breakfast, matter. Right? He goes on to say there's nothing intrinsically wicked about eating pork or lobster, and there is nothing intrinsically moral about eating cheese or chicken instead. But what the Jewish way of life does by imposing rules on our eating, sleeping, and working habits is to take the most common and mundane activities and invest them with deeper meaning, turning every one of them into an occasion for obeying or disobeying God. If a Gentile walks into a fast food establishment and orders a cheeseburger, he's just having lunch. But if a Jew does the same thing, he is making a theological statement. He is declaring that he does not accept the rules of the Jewish dietary system as binding upon him. But heeded or violated, the rules lift the act of having lunch out of the ordinary and make it into a religious matter. If you can do that to the process of eating, you have done something important, right? And for me, right, that point, and many of you have heard me say this many times, you've heard, a dozen rabbis say this many times, right? Judaism, I believe at its core, is about the sanctification of the mundane. Is about taking the most ordinary, plain, seemingly plain thing or act or behavior and transforming it into something that is extraordinary, right? Think about it. That's why we have so many blessings. That's why we have a blessing for almost anything. And most of those blessings are for the small, mundane minutia, for getting out of bed in the morning, for literally going to the bathroom, for eating a strawberry, right? As a way to see a sunset, to stop and say, this is an extraordinary thing, right? The motzi, think about the motzi. It's a blessing over a piece of bread. And by the way, it's a blessing that actually makes no sense because it thanks God for bringing forth bread from the earth, which isn't how it happens, right? But why a blessing over a piece of bread? A simple, the last week aside, quotidian kind of thing, right? Well, because there's no such thing as a small blessing, right? So again, to I think Merle's point, to the point of the text before about mindfulness is, can we transform the act of eating into something that is sacred? And I think that comes with mindfulness. And for some, absolutely, that it may not be kashrut. For some in this town, in this decade, in this day and age, for some, it's gluten-free. For some, it's cage-free, organic, whatever. For some, it's keto. For some, it's, but the act of putting thought into what goes into the grocery cart when you walk, again, during normal times, the things we take for granted, but when you walk down the aisle in the grocery store, the thought about what goes in the cart, this or this, right? The thought about how do you prepare this food that I'm going to serve, that I'm going to eat myself, that I'm going to serve to people I love and care about on that altar in my dining room, right? That we're all spending a lot more time around right now eating, 3 meals a day together, try not to kill each other, right? Or at least kill each other with who's doing the dishes, right? Thought into what are we going to eat when we go to a restaurant? Am I going to eat this? Thought into what restaurant we go to. Does this restaurant pay their workers well? Does this restaurant offer healthcare benefits? Does this, putting thought into what we eat, I think is very Jewish and really important. And the ancient Jewish answer to this mindfulness around food, which we have dozens of names for today, is kashrut. Doesn't mean that's, I would say, doesn't mean that's the best answer for everybody. But I could easily be convinced someone who tells me that, you know, they only buy organic, you know, produce and organic meats when they can, and proteins, and they don't eat any trans fats, and, you know, that's a form of kashrut. Not, you know, small k, but that's a form of being incredibly mindful about food and putting thought into it and recognizing that it's not just, or doesn't have to be just another, you know, ordinary mundane act. Merle? Let me unmute you.
I get all this because we shop at a farm, a small privately owned farm that's organic. I mean, we were there early this morning. But when
Wearing a mask, I hope.
When I'm thinking of my own dietary issues where I'm diabetic and I don't eat sugar, is that the same as, I mean, your comment about thinking about what we put in the grocery cart. I have to read all the labels imaginable. Is that a form of mindfulness?
I think so. I think.
Okay, I'm just curious.
I think personally, I think anything that forces us to slow down and pay attention and be a little more aware, and either, frankly, either by necessity, in your case, or by choice, is certainly mindfulness and is helpful, right? And to not, you know, just grab the first thing we see or the first thing that sounds like it'll taste good.
I find lighting candles on Friday night and blessing of the wine and challah, it's a mindfulness experience. You know, we realize the blessings that we have, and we always say a Mia Shabera for people that we know that need healing. And it's just a very, it's just a good feeling that we do that. You know, it's being mindful about the day and our lives and how lucky we are.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. And I think in many ways that's beyond just food, right? And that was kind of a little bit of a tangent I went on about blessings a minute ago, but that's, I think much of our tradition is about asking us to be mindful and to pay attention to whatever it is we're doing, and to not sort of sleepwalk through life, but to really be aware. The last text on here, just because we've got about a minute or two left, the last text on here really just kind of articulates all that we've been already talking about. This is an excerpt from, it's still new-ish, probably about, I don't know, 10, 12 years old. The Reform movement produced a second, I should say, Torah commentary, or a new Torah commentary that reflects, I would say, RESA, you can correct me, but reflects, I would say, I don't actually think it's fair to say it reflects a woman's perspective. I think it simply does not ignore the woman's perspective, as for many different reasons historically has been ignored from most Jewish texts and most Jewish commentaries, and put together by several brilliant female scholars from the Hebrew Union College. And it's a wonderful, wonderful resource with wonderful commentaries and insights. And this one here sort of sums up much, I think, of what we've been talking about, and kind of, I think, the right note to leave us on, where it says increasing numbers of Jews today are expanding their kashrut practice to incorporate additional ethical and environmental considerations. Was the food produced under conditions that respect persons and the environment? Were the workers who picked or prepared the food paid a living wage? Did the processes of production treat animals humanely? In addition, to following these questions to influence our choices about what to eat, we can direct our tzedakah money to organizations that address these issues, like environmental and farm worker advocacy groups, right? Just this idea that maybe there's a lot more to this sort of puzzle in terms of, you know, how we eat and how we think about food and how we think about, you know, the treatment of people than just, you know, what the animal is and how it was slaughtered and how it's prepared. So no pun intended, hopefully a little food for thought. We move into Shabbat today. Thank you everybody for taking time out of your Friday to join me. This was lovely. And I hope you enjoyed it and found it as meaningful as I did.
Thank you. We did.
Thank you.
I did.
Thank you.